This is the final moment before the crime. A woman steps out of a taxi at 4:15 in the morning. CCTV footage captures her adjusting her coat, checking her phone, walking toward her apartment building in Chinatown. She looks calm, unhurried, safe. But the surveillance camera catches something else. A man slips through the door behind her, head down, unremarkable, silent. She doesn't see him. She climbs 6 flights of stairs to her apartment, the same route she's taken hundreds of times before. He follows. Every step, every floor. What happened next inside that 6th-floor apartment horrified even veteran investigators. Neighbors heard screams. They called 911 immediately. Police arrived within minutes, but they didn't go in. For nearly an hour, officers stood outside a barricaded door while the screams went quiet. When emergency services finally breached the apartment, they found her body in the bathtub, stabbed more than 40 times. Evidence of a prolonged struggle. Evidence she fought back. And under the bed, partially undressed, the knife still nearby.
Christina Yuna Lee was murdered in her apartment around 4 in the morning. Chin says the 35-year-old victim had lived on the 6th floor of the building at 111 Christie Street for less than a year.
They found him. There was no prior connection, no stalking, no motive anyone could trace.
This homeless man, Assamad Nash, who allegedly stalked and then repeatedly stabbed Christina with a kitchen.
This was not a targeted attack. It was entirely random. This is the story of Christina Yuna Lee's final walk home and the unanswered questions that remain long after the sentencing. If you watch this video and walk away without subscribing, I understand. But if her story stays with you, if you believe cases like this deserve to be told with care, then maybe consider staying for the rest, because what the surveillance footage revealed was only the beginning. She steps out of a taxi just after 4 in the morning. The February air is cold, the kind of cold that settles into your coat and makes you walk faster toward warmth. Christina Yuna Lee adjusts her jacket, checks her phone one last time, and moves toward the entrance of her Chinatown apartment building. It is a walk she has made hundreds of times before, so familiar it barely requires thought. The street is quiet. The city for once feels still. She does not hurry. There is no reason to. At 35, Christina had built exactly the life she wanted. A creative producer working in Manhattan, she moved through the city's artistic circles with ease and purpose. Her days were filled with projects that demanded both precision and imagination, collaborations that stretched across industries and ideas. She had chosen Chinatown deliberately, not just for the affordable rent in a city that devoured paychecks, but for the community, the food, the streets that felt like home even when everything else felt uncertain. Her apartment sat on the 6th floor of a walk-up building. No elevator, 6 flights of stairs she climbed every day, sometimes twice, sometimes more. The building was older, the hallways narrow, but it was hers, a small space she had made entirely her own. That night had been unremarkable in every way that mattered. She had gone out with friends, the way she often did. Dinner, drinks, conversation that stretched past midnight and into the early hours. The kind of night that ends with tired laughter and promises to do it again soon. When she finally climbed into the taxi, she was thinking about sleep, about the weekend ahead, about nothing at all, really, except getting home. The cab dropped her at the curb and pulled away. Christina walked toward her building and reached for the door. What she did not see, what the security camera mounted above the entrance captured with silent clarity, was the figure that appeared behind her. A man, walking at the same pace, timing his steps so that when she pulled open the door, he was close enough to slip inside before it closed. There was no confrontation, no words exchanged, no moment where she turned and saw him. Christina entered her building the way she always did, and a stranger entered with her. The camera recorded all of it. His name was Assamad Nash. He was 40 years old, homeless, and had been released on supervised probation just weeks before. His criminal record included prior charges, prior arrests, prior encounters with a system that had processed him and released him and processed him again. There was no connection between him and Christina Lee. They had never met. They shared no acquaintances, no history, no reason to exist in the same frame of footage, but the camera does not lie about what it sees. It shows Christina walking through the lobby. It shows Nash following. It shows 2 people moving toward the stairwell, one unaware, one deliberate. And then the footage ends. Because there are no cameras in the stairs, What happened next would be reconstructed later from evidence and aftermath, but the shape of it is clear enough. Christina began climbing toward the 6th floor. Nash climbed behind her. 6 flights, perhaps 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes. Long enough for him to close the distance, long enough for her to remain unaware until it was too late. She reached her door, she unlocked it, she stepped inside, and before it could close behind her, Nash forced his way in. The attack began immediately. Christina fought. The evidence would make that undeniably clear. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms, the disorder throughout the apartment, the signs of a struggle that moved from room to room. She was not passive. She was not silent. She resisted with everything she had against a man who was larger, who was armed with a knife, who had already decided what he intended to do. The violence was prolonged. It was not a single act, but a sustained assault, brutal and unrelenting. Nash stabbed her more than 40 times. The attack ended in the bathroom, where Christina's body would later be found in the bathtub, bearing the evidence of every wound. But before it ended, she screamed, and her neighbors heard. The first call to 911 came within minutes. Residents of the building reported sounds of a woman in distress, loud screams, audible through walls and floors, the unmistakable noise of something terrible happening nearby. The calls were urgent. The callers were clear. A woman was in danger, possibly being attacked, in a 6th-floor apartment on Christie Street. Dispatchers logged the emergency and sent officers to the scene. For a moment, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. The cries for help had been heard. The calls had been made. Police were on their way, and the distance between tragedy and intervention was measured in blocks, in minutes, in the time it takes a patrol car to navigate the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan. Christina was still alive when those calls were placed. The timeline would later confirm it. The screams her neighbors reported were not echoes of something already finished. They were happening in real time, marking the moments of a woman fighting for her life while strangers reached for their phones. Help was coming. It would arrive quickly, and it would stop at the door. Police reached the building within minutes of the first 911 call. Officers made their way to the 6th floor following the reports, moving toward the apartment where the screaming had originated. They found the door barricaded from the inside, blocked by furniture, sealed against entry. The sounds from within had stopped. The hallway was quiet, and so began the wait. Protocol dictated caution. A barricaded door could mean anything. A hostage situation, an armed suspect, a scenario where rushing in would cost more lives than it saved. Officers called for backup. Emergency services equipped for forced entry were requested. The situation was assessed, discussed, managed according to procedure. Inside the apartment, there was only silence. For nearly an hour, police stood outside Christina Lee's door. They waited for authorization. They waited for equipment. They waited for the tactical certainty that would justify breaching a barricaded residence where the nature of the threat remained unclear. The screams had stopped. Perhaps she was safe. Perhaps the situation had resolved itself. Perhaps caution was the correct choice. But the screams had not stopped because the danger had passed. They had stopped because Christina was dying, and then because she was dead. Cases like hers disappear from the headlines within days. If you think her story deserves to be told in full, subscribe. It's the only way we can keep doing this. The delay would become the second tragedy of that night. Not the violence itself, but the proximity of help that never came in time. Officers had arrived while she was still alive, or moments after she was not, and they had waited, followed procedure, stood in a hallway, while the silence inside the apartment marked the completion of what they had been sent to prevent. The door gave way with a sound that seemed too loud for the hallway, too final for what anyone still hoped to find. Emergency personnel moved through the breach, flashlights cutting into the dim interior, voices calling out for response. The apartment was small, a studio essentially, the kind of space where everything is visible within seconds of entry. They did not have to search long. The furniture told the first part of the story. A chair overturned, items scattered across the floor, the disorder of a struggle that had moved through the space without pattern, without logic, following only the desperate geometry of survival. Whoever had lived here had not gone quietly. The walls bore witness to resistance, to a fight that had refused to end even when the outcome was already determined. And then they found her. Christina lay in the bathtub, her body still, her struggle finally over. The wounds, more than 40 of them, marked the brutality of her final minutes. Some were defensive, evidence that she had raised her hands against the blade, that she had tried to block what was coming, even as it continued. Others were not. The attack had been relentless, sustained far beyond any threshold of necessity, as though the violence itself had become the purpose. The room fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound. There is a moment, in cases like this, when the professionals who have seen everything allow themselves to stop, to absorb what is in front of them, to feel, however briefly, the weight of a life that was here and is not anymore. Christina Lee had been alive just hours ago. She had stepped out of a taxi and walked toward her door and believed, as everyone believes, that the morning would come. Now officers stood in her bathroom, bearing witness to how wrong that belief had been. The apartment was declared a crime scene. Forensic teams began the meticulous work of documentation, photographs, measurements, the careful collection of evidence that would later be assembled into a narrative for the courtroom. Every surface was examined, every trace cataloged. The story of what had happened here would be told through blood patterns and wound trajectories, through the placement of objects and the absence of others. But the investigation was about to take a turn that eliminated any need for a manhunt. One of the officers checking the apartment's remaining spaces looked under the bed. Assamad Nash was there. He was partially undressed, wedged into the narrow gap between mattress and floor, as though hiding could somehow undo what he had done. The knife was nearby, still bearing the evidence of his crime. He did not run. He did not fight. He simply waited to be pulled from his hiding place and placed in handcuffs, the arrest occurring with a swiftness that felt almost anticlimactic. There would be no mystery in this case. No weeks of investigation, no composite sketches, no public appeals for information. The perpetrator was found at the scene, in the victim's apartment, with the weapon beside him. The surveillance footage had captured his entry. The forensic evidence would connect him to every wound on Christina's body. The case, from an investigative standpoint, was as clear as cases ever are, but clarity is not the same as justice, and the discovery of Nash under that bed did nothing to answer the questions that would haunt everything that followed. Why had he been free? Why had the door remained closed for so long? Why had protocol been followed so precisely while a woman lost her life? Those questions would wait. For now, there was only the arrest. Nash escorted from the building, Christina's body removed with the quiet dignity that the living owe the dead, the apartment sealed behind yellow tape that would remain for days. The news broke that morning. By afternoon, the surveillance footage had been released to the public, and the city watched as Christina Lee took her final walk home. The video was grainy, indistinct, the kind of footage that captures everything and nothing at the same time. A woman entering a building, a man following behind her. No confrontation, no warning. Just two figures passing through the same door, their futures about to collide in ways only one of them understood. The public reaction was immediate and uncontained. Chinatown residents organized vigils. Asian American communities across the city expressed grief and outrage, linking Christina's death to a broader pattern of violence that had intensified during the pandemic years. Activists demanded answers, not just about this crime, but about the systems that had allowed it to happen. How had Nash been released? Why had police waited outside the door? Who would be held accountable for the failures that had placed Christina in harm's way? The indictment came quickly. Assamad Nash was charged with murder, burglary, and sexually motivated crimes, a combination of charges that reflected both what he had done and what he had intended. The evidence was overwhelming. His defense would not be based on denial, but on the question of mental competency, a legal strategy that would delay proceedings for months while psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Christina's family waited through that delay, as families always do. They waited through hearings and motions and the slow grinding of a system that promises justice but rarely delivers it on anyone's preferred timeline. They waited while the man who had taken Christina from them sat in a cell, alive, when she was not. The trial never happened. In mid-2024, Assamad Nash entered a guilty plea. He admitted to the murder of Christina Yuna Lee, accepting responsibility for the crime that had been evident from the moment officers pulled him from under her bed. The plea eliminated the need for a trial, spared the family the ordeal of testimony and cross-examination, and guaranteed a sentence that would keep Nash in prison for the rest of his natural life. He was sentenced to 30 years to life. The judge spoke of the gravity of the crime, of the suffering inflicted upon Christina and upon those who loved her. There were no words adequate to the moment, no sentence that could restore what had been taken, no punishment that could make the mathematics of loss balance. Christina Lee was gone. Assamad Nash would grow old in prison, and between those two facts lay a chasm that no verdict could bridge. The victim impact statements were read into the record. Christina's mother spoke of her daughter's dreams, her creativity, her capacity for joy. She spoke of the phone calls that would never come, the holidays that would remain incomplete, the grandchildren who would never exist. She spoke of watching the surveillance footage, of seeing her daughter walk toward a door and knowing what was waiting on the other side. There are some forms of knowledge that no parent should be asked to carry. The courtroom was silent as she finished. The sentence was formalized. Nash was led away to begin his decades of incarceration, and the criminal case, in the narrow sense that courts define such things, was closed. But the aftermath continued. Christina's family filed a civil lawsuit against the city of New York and the police officers who had responded that night. The suit alleged that the delay in entering the apartment had cost Christina her life, that the officers who waited in the hallway, following protocol while the screams went silent, had failed in their fundamental duty to protect. It was not a claim of malice, but of negligence, of a system that prioritized procedure over urgency, that had been designed for a different kind of crisis than the one unfolding behind that barricaded door. The lawsuit remains unresolved. The city has not admitted wrongdoing. The officers involved have not been disciplined. The policies that governed their response that night have not been publicly revised. The questions raised by Christina's death about training, about protocol, about the moment when waiting becomes abandoning, remain unanswered, officially, legally, institutionally, and so the case exists in a strange state of suspension. The criminal matter is concluded. A man has been convicted and sentenced. Justice, in its most literal form, has been served. But the civil lawsuit keeps the wound open, prevents the final period from being placed at the end of the sentence. Christina's family continues to seek accountability from a system that processed their daughter's murder with efficiency and then closed ranks against further scrutiny. The public debate has faded, as public debates always do. New tragedies have claimed the headlines. New outrages have demanded attention. The vigils in Chinatown have ended. The surveillance footage is no longer played on the evening news. Christina Yuna Lee has joined the long list of names that flare briefly into public consciousness and then recede, remembered by those who loved her, forgotten by those who merely mourned her for a news cycle. Most people scrolled past her name and never looked back. If you're still here, you're not most people. Subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that others have already moved on from. But the questions she left behind have not been answered. They persist in the policies of police departments, in the training manuals that dictate when officers enter and when they wait. They persist in the supervision systems that released Nash weeks before he followed a stranger into her building. They persist in the architecture of urban safety, in the locked doors and narrow stairwells and surveillance cameras that capture everything but prevent nothing. Christina Lee was not famous before her death. She was not powerful or connected or otherwise positioned to demand the attention of systems that prefer to operate without scrutiny. She was simply a woman who worked hard and lived independently and walked home one night believing she would wake up in the morning. Her final walk was recorded. Her screams were heard. Her door was approached by officers who had the power to enter and chose to wait. And by the time they went in, it was already too late. That is the fact that cannot be undone. That is the silence at the center of this story. A woman fought for her life while help stood in the hallway. A protocol was followed, a procedure was observed, and Christina Yuna Lee, 35 years old, creative producer, daughter, friend, became a name in a case file, a line in a sentencing transcript, a question that the system has not yet answered. Her killer will die in prison. Her family will continue their lawsuit. The surveillance footage will remain in evidence archives, available for anyone who wants to watch a woman take her final steps toward home. And somewhere in the gap between those facts, between the conviction and the silence, between justice served and accountability denied, the case of Christina Yuna Lee remains open. Not legally, not technically, but in every way that matters.